Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and if you look back at the 5th generation consoles, or the consoles that ushered in the leap to 3D, with the exception of the PlayStation, it seems to be a recurring theme that they were a real challenge to develop games for. The Atari Jaguar and the Sega Saturn were both quite the headache for programmers, and the Nintendo 64 was no exception to this. On paper at least, it shouldn't have been, as it did not have an overly complex and esoteric architecture like the Saturn and Jaguar. It didn't have half a dozen or more processors that developers needed to somehow get working all together at the same time in some convoluted way, and at that point it was the most powerful console hardware ever put to market. Despite this, it was really difficult for developers to actually use the system's strengths and make games for it. Why was that? It was mostly due to technical limitations, and some really weird ones at that. So as a quick overview of the hardware, it had a single 64-bit CPU and a single 64-bit reality coprocessor, or RCP, that mostly handled the GPU and audio functions. That's basically it. It even lacked a dedicated sound chip. Unlike the Atari Jaguar, there isn't really any debate about whether the N64 is a true 64-bit machine. Even though Atari's claim that the Jaguar was 64-bit actually wasn't without merit, and I've previously explored that in detail in this video. Having said that, even though it had an internal 64-bit bus, its external data bus was 32 bits, and most games use 32-bit instructions, but we'll circle back to that a little later. The CPU, an NEC VR4300, which was based on the Silicon Graphics MIPS 4300i, was blazingly fast, clocked at 93.75 MHz, roughly 3 times the speed of the PlayStation CPU. The RCP, also built by Silicon Graphics and also based on the same MIPS 4300i technology, was one of the most powerful 3D chips available at the time, even when bringing PC hardware into the equation. The RCP itself was composed of two main components, the Reality Display Processor or RDP and the Reality Signal Processor or RSP. Each of these also contains their own specialized components. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of exactly how these interacted with each other, but at the high level, the RSP processed the graphics data, then it was sent to the RDP to draw it to the screen, working with a frame buffer. On top of all that, it had 4 MB of system RAM, which was double what the PlayStation had, and could be increased to 8 MB with the expansion pack. Those other smaller integrated circuits you see on the right side of the board handle video encoding, digital to analog conversion of video and audio amplification. The larger one, labelled PIF, was used for system startup, reading the controllers, and a regional lockout. It might be weird to think about nowadays, but back then, Nintendo were very much about hardware power with their home consoles. Their change of direction to not compete on that level only really started with the Wii, but all of their home consoles prior to that were all aimed to be more powerful and capable than the available competition at the time of their release, and the N64 was probably the pinnacle of that. You look at all of that and you'd be forgiven for thinking it must have been amazing to work with. Unfortunately, it was anything but. Let's address the most obvious one first up before we get more technical, and discuss the N64's cartridge format. While some may claim this wasn't really much of a handicap, it definitely hindered more than it helped. While cartridges were incredibly quick with virtually no load times, the storage capacity was severely limited. The largest size that N64 cartridges reached was 512 megabits, or just 64 megabytes. This was as big as they ever got, and this number was less than a tenth of the storage capacity of the CD format that the PlayStation and Saturn used. Remember how I mentioned a little earlier that most games used 32-bit instructions? One of the primary reasons for this was to save on cartridge space, as 32-bit binaries were smaller than 64-bit binaries, and they were also faster too. Nintendo's choice to make the N64 cartridge-based turned a lot of third-party developers off the platform, especially Japanese developers. Big names such as Squaresoft, Namco, Capcom, Atlus, Enix and Konami, after years of making successful games on the Famicom and Super Famicom, mostly turned their backs on Nintendo and committed to PlayStation. This exodus was as much for financial reasons as it was technical ones. Cartridges were much more expensive than CDs to develop for and manufacture, and Nintendo wanted high royalties. Only a couple of games, such as Resident Evil 2, actually reached this maximum size though. Most N64 games were in the 128 to 256 megabit range, or 16 to 32 megabytes, as storage was expensive and developers generally tried to keep games as small as possible. Conversely, CD-based consoles didn't have that restriction. CDs had a capacity of about 650 megabytes at the time, and they could use all of that, as CDs only came in one size. They didn't really need to worry about how much space they were using, so they tended to fill the disk up with as much content as possible. On top of that, if they needed to, they could even split games onto multiple disks, something the N64 couldn't replicate with cartridges. This often meant that the N64 couldn't really do full motion video, or FMV, as these were large files and were often the first to go when trying to squeeze a game down to fit, with most games opting for in-game cutscenes instead. A handful of games managed it, albeit heavily compressed, such as the aforementioned Resident Evil 2, but that wasn't the only sacrifice that often happened. It also meant it commonly didn't have the space to store high quality audio files. The system was technically capable of playing CD quality audio, the hardware was there to do so, but the reality was many games needed to compress their audio so much to fit it onto the cartridge that it didn't sound like CD quality at all.
I thought you were one of them.
What's going on in this town?
Hold on. I don't have a clue. By the time I noticed something was wrong, the entire city was infested with zombies. I thought you were one of them.
What's going on in this town?
Hold on. I don't have a clue. By the time I noticed something was wrong, the entire city was infested with zombies. Fight!
Cabal wins.
Round 2, fight!
Well done, Cabal wins.
Some developers did manage to produce some pretty amazing sound out of it, so it was clearly quite capable, but some other sacrifices often needed to be made to make it happen. It also meant there was limited space to store texture data, but even if they could store more, developers would still have been handicapped. Why? Good question. Prior to the N64, most consoles, including the PlayStation and Saturn, had specific RAM for functions like video and sound. The sound RAM, for example, could only be used for sound, and if you didn't use all of the available sound RAM, you couldn't use the leftover portion for anything else, such as textures for example. The Nintendo 64, on the other hand, used what's called a Unified Memory Architecture, or UMA. What this meant was that the system's RAM could be used for pretty much anything the developers saw fit. There were basically no restrictions for what you could or couldn't temporarily store in the RAM. The N64 wasn't the first console to have UMA, but it was the first successful one, and the idea, at least in theory, sounds great. In practice, it didn't really work out that well though, and had its fair share of drawbacks. The Silicon Graphics RCP was an incredibly advanced and powerful chip at the time, but it was only given 4 kilobytes, yes you heard that right, kilobytes of texture cache to work with, and that was the maximum size you could use. This doesn't sound like a lot, and it wasn't, even back then. What this meant in practical terms was that the maximum texture size was just 64 by 64 pixels for a colored texture. The N64 lacked VRAM and sound RAM completely, so due to its UMA design, the main system RAM needed to be used for these, which took resources away from other processors. The PlayStation and Saturn having dedicated video and sound RAM meant that the only data being sent to them was video or sound. On the N64, the CPU, video, and sound all needed to share the same memory bandwidth, creating an obvious place for bottlenecks. Oh, the unified RAM needed to be used to store the frame buffer too, by the way. The N64 also used trilinear filtering for its textures at the hardware level, whereas the competition really had nothing like that in place. And of course, there simply wasn't space to have a large number of high quality textures, resulting in textures needing to be heavily compressed, as the storage capacity of cartridges rears its ugly head again.
When danger reared its ugly head, he bravely turned his tail and fled.
This basically meant that most N64 games had blurry, low resolution textures, or lots of small repeated textures, or even no textures at all, instead needing to basically fill polygons with solid colours and use a technique called GURAD shading. What GURAD shading meant in the simplest terms was that they used the hardware to control the game lighting in a specific way to give the illusion that these solid colour polygons were actually textured. It was named after the inventor Henry GURAD in 1971. Instead of calculating the lighting per polygon, as what happens with flat shading, it's calculated per vertex. It obviously looks a lot better than flat shading, at the expense of some performance, but it was kind of necessitated on the N64 due to the lack of texture memory. The N64 wasn't the only console with games that used this, as the Jaguar, Saturn and PlayStation were all capable of GURAD shading and used it to varying degrees, but Nintendo's machine employed it much more liberally and extensively, especially on character models. This is why a significant chunk of the N64's games looked bright, colourful and cartoony, as opposed to the more realistic look many PlayStation games tended to have. Some pundits say that this was actually an advantage for the N64, as it gave the visuals more clarity and didn't look washed out and grainy like those often seen on competing platforms. Many gamers even prefer the N64's graphical style, and you could legitimately argue it's aged much better than the 3D games on the other 5th generation consoles. The trilinear filtering, while resulting in blurry textures, actually did make things look smoother and less jagged than PlayStation and Saturn games, especially when combined with anti-aliasing, which those two consoles lacked hardware support for. Using modern emulators, we can do stuff like disable anti-aliasing, swap to bilinear filtering, and sharpen the textures, to get an idea of what games might have looked like without the restrictions. While it does look better in some aspects, such as the HUD, it looks worse in others. You can see the seams between the textures on the ground, for example, and the edges of Mario's model look a lot more jagged. If you want to explore this topic more, I'll leave a link to a great video by Kei's Emmanuel in the description. Former president of Nintendo, the late Satoru Iwata, who was the president of Nintendo first-party developer HAL Laboratory at the time, had this to say on the topic of the texture cache as part of his Iwata Asks feature in 2010. With the Nintendo 64, the size of textures was severely limited. If you didn't contrive something clever when making the data, the processing speed would drop dramatically. Whoa, wait a second, hold up. Why would the processing speed drop dramatically? This was largely attributed to the fact the CPU did not have direct access to the system's RAM, so it needed to go through the RCP to do it. Why would that be the case? This was a consequence of using the UMA approach. Access to the RAM was essentially managed by the RCP, so when the various components needed to read from or write to the RAM, they needed to request it from the RCP, and the CPU, unfortunately, was no exception to this. The RCP needed to balance the requests from the CPU as well as its own requests, which included sending RAM requests for video and sound, and if this wasn't done in a smart way, performance would fall. Ouch. This poor performance was unfortunately demonstrated in more than a few games during the console's lifespan, as many titles struggled to maintain a consistent frame rate, despite the N64's raw power on paper. This was especially apparent if the game was running in split screen or supported a high resolution mode with the expansion pack. If you watch speedruns of many N64 games, you might notice the runners often looking down at the ground, up at the sky, or off in a random direction, and that's in order to minimize the slowdown. This weird setup effectively made the RCP the main driving force of the system, and if you think about it, even though RCP is literally an initialism for Reality Coprocessor, it's the actual CPU that was treated more like a coprocessor. As I mentioned previously, the RCP itself was composed of two main components, the RDP and the RSP. The RSP component was designed to be programmed with microcode, which allowed developers, in theory at least, to alter its functions, such as favouring speed over quality. It sounds like a good idea to give it a great degree of flexibility and customization, right? Nintendo provided a kind of base default microcode to game makers that they had developed alongside Silicon Graphics when designing the hardware, but reportedly it was not optimized very well. But no matter, this shouldn't have been that big of a problem, as developers surely could modify the microcode or write their own to extract the performance they needed. Well, not really. For some reason, Nintendo apparently did not give developers access to the microcode tools until the last couple of years of the console's life. Even once they did, programming the microcode for the RSP was allegedly very difficult due to insufficient debugging tools and poor documentation. Regardless, several studios, including Rare and Factor 5, did manage to eventually write their own microcode to truly unlock the power of the RSP, and by extension, the RCP. In Rare's case, you can easily see this when you study one of their later games like Conker's Bad Fur Day or Perfect Dark. Factor 5, a studio of wizards that I've spoken about several times in past videos in regards to their 16-bit games, achieved some amazing results. They can be observed by looking at their late release games like Star Wars Episode 1 Battle for Naboo, not to mention their incredibly impressive port of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine. Boss Game Studios, a developer that basically lived and died during the N64's lifetime, also apparently wrote their own microcode for games like Stunt Racer 64. If you look at these next to many other games in the N64's catalogue, even the earlier games from these studios, they really do seem to be on another level graphically. Given what was achieved with games like those, it makes you wonder exactly what we could have seen if things had been different from the start. Nintendo's decision to effectively lock down the microcode for the RSP really seems like a big misjudgment. When it came down to it, the Nintendo 64 provided incredibly high-end, market-leading hardware and concepts that sounded great in theory, but for a whole host of reasons, restricted what developers could do with it. Compounding the problem was that for the most part, Nintendo went all in on 3D games with the N64 and tried to leave 2D games behind. Very few of the games in the console's catalogue were truly 2D. There were a handful, such as Yoshi's Story, StarCraft 64, and the Mortal Kombat Trilogy, but their pickings were pretty slim. The PlayStation and Saturn, on the other hand, both had an abundance of 2D games. While the West tended to embrace the transition to 3D, the Japanese audience wasn't so keen. Due to losing support of many Japanese third-party developers, the majority of the games released for it, excluding those that were created by Nintendo themselves, were made by Western studios, such as Rare, Factor 5, and Iguana Entertainment. Games made by these developers were obviously targeted more towards Western audiences, but the Japanese demographic were not keen on GoldenEye 007, Star Wars, and Turok. They wanted Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Street Fighter. It's also a problem that has continued to plague Microsoft's Xbox platform in the region to this day. Hardware designer Genyo Takeda apparently admitted that when they made the Nintendo 64, they thought it was logical that, if you want to make advanced games, it becomes technically more difficult. But they were wrong. They understood it's the cruising speed that matters, not the momentary flash of peak power. He would use the Japanese word hansai, meaning self-reflection, when remembering that time. As the story goes, Nintendo president during this period, Hiroshi Yamauchi, admitted circa 2001 that he deliberately requested that the engineers make the N64 difficult for programmers to work with. Apparently, for their 8 and 16-bit machines, he would personally review and improve every game for those consoles to give it the official Nintendo seal of quality. When the N64 came along, he couldn't sustain that practice, so ordered the system to be challenging to develop for in order to discourage less talented studios from making low-quality games. Now, I will say, it's difficult to determine whether this is actually true or not. The source of this claim appears to be this article, written by Pete Davidson after Yamauchi passed away in 2013, titled Hiroshi Yamauchi, The Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove, that was published on several sites including US Gamer and VG247. But there's actually no source to back this up in the article itself, and I couldn't find any direct quotes from him that proves he said it. Assuming he did say it, it was likely a PR statement after the fact when trying to explain the console's lack of success in Japan. Something else he apparently said, but seems to be impossible to actually verify, is that he believed the PlayStation beat the N64 in Japan because Japanese gamers, quote, like to be alone in their rooms and play depressing games, as he was known to be not much of a fan of RPGs, a genre that the N64 was almost totally devoid of. Once again though, this one seems to come from a single unsighted source, in this case a snippet from the magazine Gamers Republic, which was posted to Nintendo Life in 2020 and spread from there. Everyone just seems to assume this to be true, and plenty of sites large and small have reposted this, but I found no actual evidence, no transcripts, no videos, no audio recordings that proves he ever said it. The closest I found was this quote where he said that the market was being flooded with boring and complicated games, which isn't the same thing. So you can choose to believe it or not. Assuming his strategy to weed out the less talented developers was true, it did seem to work for the most part, though it didn't stop games like Superman 64 from sneaking through. Probably unsurprisingly, Yamauchi reversed his request when it came to the GameCube, asking for games to be easier to build for it instead. Conversely, after making the PlayStation easy to work on and welcoming third parties with open arms, Ken Kutaragi and Sony did a 180, with the PlayStation 2 and the PlayStation 3 both being real pains in the butt for programmers, but that's a topic for another time. The script for this video is adapted from a section of my book, Secrets of Video Game Consoles, which contains more than 230 facts expanded out into detail about many consoles throughout history, ranging from the Magnavox Odyssey to the Nintendo Switch. Did you know the design of the PlayStation 2 is actually based off an unreleased Atari prototype? Or that an obscure family of consoles from Europe were actually the first to use analog joysticks? Or that the Nintendo 64 was actually not the first console to include 4 controller ports? Then this book is for you. You can purchase it directly from the publisher, and I'll leave a link below where you can do so, and I'll also include some links where you can order it through stores. It's available in both physical and ebook format, so check it out if cool facts and trivia about video game consoles interests you, or maybe buy it as a gift for someone else. As a bit of a bonus, you probably already know this as it's quite old, but just in case you don't, try typing "do a barrel roll" into Google and see what happens. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Do a barrel roll!